So, well, those are hard conversations to cut off. We are going to try to bring to everybody the key buckets of what you talked about. So pull out your phones again, or your tablets. The poll that we are going to do now. What do you think your key areas of improvement are? Oh, excuse me, sorry. What is the one area of improvement that you think your organization should make to improve its case for funding? So essentially, if you had to boil down what you talked about with your neighbor, would it be about better articulating your vision for change? Would it be improving your theory of change? Would it be clarifying your metrics? Strengthening your leadership? And this is anonymous. Or develop a more sustainable business model? Or something else? Okay, the lines are still moving around a little bit, but I think we've got themes here. Improve our theory of change. So we will make sure that we drill into that with the new Teachers Center with your question. That is really important as you all are suggesting and developing a sustainable business model. No surprise there. Great. All right, so it's Q&A time. I don't know if you've been writing down your questions that you might have for the panelists. What we are going to do is we're going to ask those of you who have questions to stand up. We have 2 microphones. One over here, and then Kenji has one. And what we're going to try is we're going to try to get the questions out, and then we'll summarize some of the themes and have the panelists answer those, okay? And then we will also go back to the theory of change, so we'll have to go back a few slides. Who here has a question? And as my colleague at SV2 says, please make sure it's a question. Just go ahead, stand on up.
So you talked a little bit about sort of experimenting with your funding models. And as a development officer at a nonprofit, how do you go about experimenting when you're just trying to make ends meet? And how do you sort of make that priority without neglecting your other absolute demands that you have to face?
Great question.
I'm just wondering, what advice do you have for organizations? I hope we're not sort of the only one that has to do a lot of things because there's no other organizations doing. And then as you grow bigger, then you get just scared that then funders are gonna just see that you're growing too much, and then they might think that you're not the small nonprofit and they don't support you anymore.
So when you are in a small nonprofit and you don't necessarily have a pre-existing relationship with an institutional donor or a foundation, theoretically, you should be getting in these conversations that are deep and about what the foundation needs. But what do you do if you're small and not known and don't have a relationship or an entree and you can't get in the door and actually have that conversation? Related to that is when you're asked in the application, who are the other funders who are funding you? There are different ways that one can do that, and if you have a dialogue with your funder, you can find out what they're trying to find out, whether they want to follow smart money, or whether they want to find out if you've got nobody else or not. But if you don't have a conversation with the funder, you can't really know how to answer that.
I'm curious about experimenting versus chasing money, and how you view that when you read various applications, because I think there's such a fine line when you're a small nonprofit trying to grow and you want to stick with your strategic kind of mission, but there are opportunities for growth that are a little sometimes out of your realm a little. So I kind of wanted just your thoughts about the difference between experimenting and kind of chasing the money.
I had a quick question about success when we were trying to explain that to a funder. How do we keep success and failure not on opposite sides of the coin, but on the same side, where it's we want to show them that we're improving, but not kind of shoot ourselves in the foot by talking about our failures so much, where we kind of kick ourselves out of the competition.
Yeah.
So I had a question, Lance. On that one slide, you said these are direct fees. They're paying for this service, and this is things to make us better, faster. How do you determine where they go? And then also, if you're going to write grants, are you writing grants just for the things that are bigger, faster? Can you kind of put it in the programs? Make sense? Okay.
I am coming from a larger nonprofit and have many of the same questions I think that the smaller nonprofits do, but also want to flip it on the other side and kind of ask, how do you make this compelling message that a funder is not just a drop in the bucket, and that their funding is going to make a big impact, kind of speaking to that balance of, I think, doing things that you're already doing and finding that connection, whereas I come across a lot of funders that want to see that we'll do something different with their money or do something bigger with their money so that there is that larger impact.
As board chair, Lance, this is maybe directed to you a little bit, but how do you actually get your CEO to think about changing the way they think about funding and revenue models, et cetera, as well as, to Jen's point, how do you get them to really think and understand the cost of actually going for a specific grant and why that's important?
All right.
I have a question. We have a small school, urban school in San Jose that affects the urban poor, but it's very small, under 130 students. And so how do we, in a sense, ask for funds when we're just really just a drop in the bucket? We're only affecting 130 students at a time, as opposed to other that may be affecting thousands and millions. So that kind of can one person make a difference in educating one kid at a time?
Okay, any other burning questions? Those are all great, and I am seeing some themes. Yes?
I guess I think a lot of the things that you've brought up are really important. So I guess as a new executive director, what are the, if everything's important, how do you prioritize? Because I feel like I need to do all of these things and I probably should have done them yesterday. So where do I start?
Empathize.
So you mentioned collaboration, and I feel like that's an increasing theme that we hear from funders. What does that look like successfully, as opposed to just listing like we partner with this organization or that organization? And then if we have time to go back to the theory of change slide at some point, I'll have a follow-up question there.
Okay.
Yes, I'm.
Did everyone hear could we elaborate on the board chair ED relationship? And why don't we actually start there and then I'll tee up some questions. And I actually we have a lot of expertise in the room, not just on the panel. So if you heard a question that you have some experience with, feel free to put your hand up. I don't know that we're going to be able to get to every single one of those great questions, but I know the panelists will stay afterwards as well to try to get some of those answered. So, Lance, why don't you speak, if you could, briefly to this ED, board chair relationship, which then can tie into a few of the other questions about how do you incent and work with your ED to change mindsets potentially.
Yeah, so I mean, as all of you appreciate in this room, right? I mean, the chair-ED relationship sets the tone for the whole organization. So, I mean, I think first and foremost, it has to be built around trust. And so you have to want to be there. And if you actually get a bad board chair, you want them out quick. If you get a good board chair, you want them to be there long. So any organizations that kind of have a one-year annual renewal, it's going to be hard to ever get leadership. So if you look at the great nonprofits that have just really outperformed everyone else, typically that board chair has been in that position between 5 and 10 years. Okay, and that's a great one, right? Who really, so that means number one, they're building trust. That means number two, that the chair thinks of themselves as a thought partner, right? So they think of themselves as trying to be a co-captain. And SV2 had its annual meeting last month, and we had a great speaker named Van Jones, who used to run the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, who's now hosts CNN Crossfire. And so as an ED, what he said was the single most important thing I need from my board chair is I need somebody to tell the truth to, because I'm lying to everybody all day long. No, I'm going to tell a good story, right? You need to tell a good story. But I need somebody to tell the truth to. So I think, so if that's what's important, then you need to be able to begin to have a conversation about expectations, right? Because unless you start to have that conversation about expectations, you're not going to get the right board chair. Even if it's the right person, they probably don't realize now they're in the major leagues and not the minor leagues.
In terms of the questions around CEOs, the mind shift, also the question here that we led off with, which I think is a great one, and I think everyone in the room empathizes. We are just trying to keep our heads above water. How can we even talk about piloting and experimenting and doing things differently? We're just coming out of a strategic plan. I will be going to my board, this is just one example, but to say, hold me accountable for innovation and experimentation. And it's not going to work. I'm going to come back and ask me, what did I try and what did I learn and where did we fail? You know, it's early to see how that conversation's going to go, but there might be ways that you could ask for or build in some incentives, almost like a coach to, you know, let's take 3 things over the next year to experiment with on the revenue side. You know, not a list of 100 because it's completely overwhelming, but maybe there are some big bets. And if you do it with the spirit of learning, you know, fail fast if you do, so you can go on to something else. And hopefully it's not just the executive director or the development director that's holding that. Hopefully it can be the whole organization from board down to frontline staff, you know, embracing. And just as a piece of language that we've started using at SV2 for those, it's, you know, confetti moments. And we have confetti moments for wonderful successes and also fantastic failures where we learn. And it goes a little bit to your question in the back about how do you know, with funders in that dialogue or prospective funders, share what you're learning, what you failed. And it is 2 sides of the same coin, success and failure. I do think that we have more space for those conversations because of where we sit here in Silicon Valley, you know, particularly if you're pitching to a venture capitalist, but also the funders, I think, in this space here in the Bay Area versus, say, the East Coast, will ask you, you know, it's as a former funder, it was on my top 5 questions to ask about when things didn't go right and what you learned from. So I think having an answer to that and reflecting on that and being confident in it and saying what you learned and how you're, you know, the gold is in what you learned from it and how you're doing things different. And that's success. That's confetti.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that a little bit. I think that is a risk, but it's also being candid and open and coming forth with it. With Jen's comment about the audit, you know, coming out with things right away. When you're a funder, it makes you a little nervous when you have to dig for it. So if the failure is sort of buried way deep and come out with what you've learned from it, the failure will be secondary, but you just want to be honest, open, have that dialogue. I think it is a safer space here where we are, just as Jen said. It's just a matter of making sure you're not hiding it so we don't feel like we're, you know, uncovering something that makes us nervous.
I think I would just add that, you know, the experimentation, how do you do that while you're maintaining kind of your core work? And, you know, start small, try little things, and is there a challenge? And it doesn't have to be a grand experiment, but something when you're just trying to keep your head above water. Is there some different approach that you can try to pilot it very quickly? And it can be small, and you have to start very small. And, you know, I don't want to put anyone on the spot here, but at the Packard Foundation, what we've been doing is actually helping some of the grantees that we work with to think about adaptive capacity. What does experimentation look like, and what does that look like? And I know Mario has been in that program, and they've tried that thing together, different small experiments. And so it might be interesting if you want to connect with Mario after to hear about, you know, what does that experimentation look like? And it's not some huge transformational innovation, but starting small and trying something that's kind of bite-sized to start out with.
And now that Mario's been called out here, I think he also has some experience on the question of collaboration, too. What does that really look like? And we can talk about collaboration, and I believe you were part of an out-of-school time collaborative that was paid for in part by the Packard Foundation, Sobrato, and SV2, a 3-year collaborative effort. And I think there were some real benefits that you could share afterwards. But I think that the key being, it takes resources and incentives to collaborate. It doesn't just happen. And what that means is, because we're keeping our heads up, trying to keep our heads above water, it often doesn't happen when it's right there, even the opportunity to collaborate, because then it would happen at 3 a.m. in the morning and people are sleeping at that point. So just to acknowledge that reality. So what can one do? One, acknowledging that it takes resources to collaborate, but framing what would be the end goal, what would be the benefit, what's the vision for the end goal of that collaboration. What can you learn, sharing best practices from those who are working on a similar problem, but maybe from a different lens. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then, as I said before, if you're an executive director, ask your board, as I'm going to do this year, hold me accountable for collaboration in the field, building strategic alliances. Because candidly, that's what falls off the plate when I'm working on the budget late at night, and because it's not mission critical. I mean, in fact, it really is mission critical if you think about it, but it's not something that has to happen that minute, versus what a lot of staff members are focusing on are things that really are, the next 5 minutes or that day. So if you can think about how you set incentives for yourself, for your organization, and then put some resources into it in the budgeting process. And also, I'd also advocate for budgeting for some evaluation. So all of these building blocks, we haven't talked about it, but they do certainly cost money. And where you put them in your line items, that's something that would be good to have a conversation with your board about, and also your funders, because there are different places to put evaluation expenses, for instance, in programs or leadership development. But those are all key pieces, so having that conversation with funders, I think is quite important.
Jen, I might add, actually, speaking of conversations with funders, I think, people should feel comfortable to say, no at times, and it's no, now is not the time for collaboration, no is not the opportunity for us, but with good solid reasoning of why. We don't have the capacity, it's not the right moment. We tried to collaborate several years ago, and I think people would respect it. I know we would if someone said to us, this is just not the time for us to collaborate, and it's just we don't have the resources at the moment, or 2 years down the road. And I think people would respect you if you also even said no. And so we hear a lot about funders want us to collaborate. We get that a lot ourselves too when our board asks us, are we working with XYZ Foundation? How are we collaborating with them? And there are times where, as long as we've looked into it, we've done the research, and it's just not the right time and not the right opportunity. I think it should be allowable to say no.
I wanted to weigh in on the resource question you brought up about all of these things do take resources. Just from Sobrato's perspective, we've been doing a lot of general operating support for a very long time. We allow you to use it however you think most appropriate for your organization. And many times we get back in the outcomes report, it's been used for, programs, staff, and all the bare bones to keep your, the roof airtight and just the bare bones minimum going. So something to think about as you think about investing in your organization is make sure that you're using those unrestricted funds towards the things that are really important to advance your mission, to advance your organization. So being candid with funders about what you actually need. We ask a lot of questions about what's your biggest challenge, what's your biggest organizational challenge right now, what's your biggest staff capacity challenge. Being honest with that, and then being, giving your organizations the freedom to use that funding when you need it for things it's very difficult to fundraise for. If you're getting general operating support, just think about how you can use it and leverage that to really advance your organization.
So I just wanted to build on two things. I just wanted to come back to, do we talk about failure or not? And to me, it's like, I get excited about an organization by the vision, but I get excited about the person when they tell me that. Because that means, yes, this didn't work, and here's what we're doing about it, right? Because that shows me that you have a yes and mindset. and that you're willing to build on that. Because that's how we learn, right? We learn way more from failure than we learn from success. The second thing is we kind of talk about experimentation, but let me just root it in 2 simple examples so you have a way to think about this. So I'm going to use an organization which some of you may have heard of called Reading Partners. Again, teaches struggling elementary school kids to read, right, using volunteer tutors. That organization had a financial model that was 100% philanthropy. Really hard to scale because, if you want to help every kid in Silicon Valley, you need to raise $1 billion a year. That's not doable. So what we decided to do was, could we, on the side, as demand increased for the service, ask somebody to pay for it? That was just a little experiment, a little pilot. We asked one school, would you be willing to pay for it? Because we gave it away for free. And then as one paid for it, then we asked another one to pay for it, then we asked more to pay for it. So that's just one example of how you can try something. It's not the core program. We didn't ask everybody to pay for it at once. When demand exceeded supply, we asked one school to pay for it. Okay, now let's go to the program side. Same model. When that organization started, it had to have a school teacher in each classroom, which was $75,000 a year with benefits. So on the side, in one place, we said, could we bring in an AmeriCorps college graduate at $6,000 a year and get the same result? And we did, and we tried it in one school and it worked. Then we tried it in 2 schools and it worked. Then we tried it in 4 schools and it worked. And then 25% and 100%. So within a period of 3 years, we lowered that cost structure from $75,000 to $6,000. Just by trying to experiment in one place. And if it worked, building on it. So those are just 2 simple examples.
Okay, so Catherine asked a great question over there that is going to be very challenging to answer, but we're going to give it a shot. And if paraphrasing, I'm a small nonprofit, we're just not known. How do I even get into the door to have conversations? And I saw a lot of people nodding. Again, that's a real challenge. I don't know if our panel here have any, tips or tricks, or I'm also going to turn that out to the wisdom in the room. If you're a small nonprofit yourself and you have tried things to get into the door, is there anything that has worked for you? Realizing that this whole conversation, nothing that we tell you today will ensure that you, one, get in the door and get a grant. But it is about increasing the probability of that happening in your work. Any ideas, team? Wider team?
Okay, so she's at a small school. The school obviously gets funding from somewhere. I would have the school that loves you guys being there, the board, they have an education foundation. They should help you and go out and ask people to fund on your behalf.
So using your allies if you have some affiliation? Yeah, please.
I'm a board member for a young nonprofit based in San Francisco. We actually...
We're going to give you a mic there.
And some of the foundations actually want to see metrics, right? They want to see 3+ years of stuff. And unfortunately, this particular nonprofit does not have that. So we have been denied over and over again as one of the volunteer development writers. Our big challenge, after we've been told no numerous times, is to just rebuild on those particular relationships and connecting with the people who actually say no and find out why. And truthfully, sometimes it's no again the second year, and it's talking to them and taking them out to lunch or coffee, and again, how can we change our messaging? What do we need to do? What should we be looking at? But it's back to Lance's comment about how the people matter. It's about building the relationships, but truly spending the time in building those relationships.
And what you're doing that's so important is then you're not asking for money, you're asking for advice.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you're also not taking no,
because I hear no a lot.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Not yet.
I'll comment that it really is a challenge sometimes to get through the door, particularly with foundations that, have a no invitation policy, so you can't get through the door literally. We actually have an open policy, but it's still really challenging for us. I think, we have about 200 grantees, as I mentioned. We have about 3 program staff that work on grants, and I think it was in 2010 we had the highest number of just general inquiries, one-page opportunities coming in, and it was about 360 something. Let me just tell you a little bit about the organization, and it's hard to be able to filter and give a proper response to a lot of the different entities. And for some of the ones that really rise to the top, I think it's leveraging the existing funding relationships that you have. And at times, it's easier if somebody has kind of, taken the opportunity to actually having funded the organizations to, advocate on their behalf. So if Mara knows of an organization and says, we'd like to make an introduction, it's something that we'll look at because we know it probably has met some of these different building blocks. And so leveraging the existing funding sources that you already have because, obviously you've made it through the door somewhere. And there are great people who believe in your organization. And, the challenge is not so much sometimes, it's access is the challenge. And so finding ways to kind of break through that access and leveraging your existing funding relationships is a great opportunity to do that.
I see a hand in the back. Do you want to comment on?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. One of the things that a lot of organizations want to do, they really rely on their board for funding. And a lot of times when it comes to diversifying a board, sometimes you can kind of hope that maybe a board member doesn't have a lot of money to give, but to have the connections to make that second and third touch. So that could be also a way that you can find more funding for your organization or for your school is through finding those individuals that might not be so flush with cash on your board, but to find someone that knows a lot of people in the area or knows a lot of people nationally that can start those conversations with a foundation or start that conversation with a high donor. So that's just another suggestion that works.
Great. And then we had 2 hands up here. One, we can get it. We'll go to you next, and we'll get him. You've got the mic here.
And just another thought there is you talked about serving about 130 students, and have your staff and your board really get in the habit of talking about impact. And it's not 130 students. It's what is the ripple effects? How is that changing the community and their communities and their neighborhoods? What's the outreach there? And then also think about modeling. So is this something that's scalable? And is it scalable for you guys, or maybe that's not part of your business model, but it's scalable from others? So if you tapped into something that's really effective, being able to talk to your funders about how it's scalable and how it can be a role model for other entities can be very valuable, even if you just stay at that 130 students.
So Catherine, you know this. I think sometimes it's, we forget that our nonprofit colleagues sometimes would have good referrals for us too. Even though sometimes we look at nonprofits as competitors, there are your colleagues who you are already collaborating with, or you have existing networks like a Thrive, where there are opportunities for you to meet funders or meet a board member of a nonprofit or board member of a foundation. I mean, there are just so many opportunities to meet people, and I think instead of thinking the only way we can get in the door of a foundation is by calling on them or cold calling, there are other opportunities and community events that, just keeping an open mind and just remember to really leverage your existing network. And also remember to pay it forward too. If you see a nonprofit that you're starting to work with or a new nonprofit that could use an introduction, I think it's a great time to do that. So we're all in it together.
But that's terrific advice. The signal effect that getting funds from certain funders can serve as, so whether it's the Packard Foundation or Sobrato, with the high probability that organizations that have been funded by these 2 foundations and many others do have the fundamental building blocks, one of which is a theory of change, which many of you suggested you might need to consider at a greater level of detail. I'm going to see if we can go back to the new Teacher Center slide. So Lance, we'll hear what your question is, if there's something specific, but just to provide some space for any other questions or thoughts around the all-important building block of a theory of change before we move on to the final panel conversation here.
My question is, as you
impact, how do you think about the quadrants of that circle and what make up the 4 quadrants that you have there and in terms of developing them?
Yeah, so I think about, so there's kind of the, you would say direct and indirect impacts, right? So, I mean, what we know through this program and what you know through reading the education and scientific literature is that if you deal with a teacher alone in a vacuum, okay, it doesn't help, right? And it needs to be a highly professional mentoring program. So you have to deal with a new teacher and you have to have a full-time professionally trained mentor. And both of those have to be working together as well as in their own individual communities of practice and learning from their peers. What we found out the hard way is that a crappy principal screws it all up. So we have to deal with the school leader in addition to that. And then that becomes a stake in the ground to say that's a non-negotiable. Okay, if you aren't willing to do that, we can't do that. So that's why that's in there. And then the fourth one is just really continuous improvement, right? That's really what that is.
So the last theme that I picked up in 2 questions, which I'm just going to call the shiny new object syndrome. You asked a question from a large nonprofit perspective about funders who seem to want to fund something bigger, better, new, as it maybe opposed to some of the the core that's needed. I don't know if you or anyone else in the audience has both experience with that, but also recommendations on how to help funders fund what's actually core as opposed to the shiny new objects.
I could weigh into that a little bit. I think part of it is when, as funders, we're looking at your core program. I think getting some of these things in place and being true and knowing yourself and knowing your organization and knowing the impact or the deep impact that you have, I think there is an element of making that shiny and new. If you're going really deep with your program model about the school, a really high-touch model that's deep and the impact is deep, sometimes you can, if there is that tendency to want to go after the new thing, you pivot that to make sure that you're going after something that's high quality, that you've experimented with your model. If you're big, if you know your organization, you've gone through that sort of that evolution and learning cycle, and you're able to articulate that. There is an ability to sell your organization as something that's deep and effective versus just chasing a new program.
I would echo that. I think there's so much value in the kind of deep, long-term work. And over time, there's probably new, shiny ways you've approached doing your work to get to where you are. And so at least, it's so many foundations are different. There's always that same old saying that you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And for us, actually, the Packard Foundation, we just had our 50th we are in our 50th anniversary, but yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the foundation's first board meeting ever. And, we've been looking back a lot at kind of the historical work we've done, and, we're really proud that there's some organizations that we started funding, that we're still funding today, that we started funding, a year ago. I mean, a year after the foundation was created. And so, over time, we've always had an interest also in kind of somewhat of this shiny new thing, but a lot of the shiny new thing, it comes from the existing organizations that we work with. It might be a new approach, or it might be an existing approach, but kind of new knowledge about the impact one is having. So, just kind of my word of, I guess, reinforcement that the shiny new thing is often the, old, tried, true, high impact thing as well, too.
So those are great questions. I'm going to begin to wrap us up today with some final thoughts from the panel here. Lance did mention to me when you all were talking that he had a few more mistakes that he was interested in sharing. So walk away with those. Take it away, Lance.
I have too many for the time allowed. But I talked about 2 of the 3 things. I just wanted to kind of reemphasize 3 things, and that is this whole concept of more and better. And you have to personalize that as to what that means to you. But more could be more people that you serve, more could be going deeper with the existing people that you serve, but what does more and better mean to you? And especially when we get into this experimental mindset, that's one of the reasons I gave you that example, is sometimes with that you have to go slow and do it in small steps, okay, to be able to go fast later, right? Because you can't just flip your whole program on a dime, but how do you embrace go slow to go fast? And then the last one is, this work is really hard, right? So I think there's this embracing of messiness, right? So the messiness that you think you can manage, embrace the heck out of it. And if you can't manage it, boot it out. But you just embrace the manageable part of this stuff, right? Because it's really ambiguous, but that's what makes it fun and challenging.
See a lot of nodding heads. Adaptability, Irene?
Yes, I think if I were to think about kind of, where we sit and what's really important, and I think it's really understanding your organization, understanding the ecosystem in which you work, which really ties back to the theory of change, and being able to adapt your programs within that ecosystem. When we think about kind of high-performing organizations that we invest in, a lot of it is about those who can adjust to the environment, whether it's a downturn in the economy. We fund a lot of arts organizations, whether it's the way that people are consuming culture these days, but to be able to adapt their programs and really adapt but keep kind of the core mission and vision of the organization true.
So you mentioned the ecosystem. Mara, Sobrato, you all have a small but mighty and wonderful staff, many of whom are here, and I know you've had 8 to 9 years reading applications and seeing a lot. I'm curious what you've learned, not about nonprofits and how they can put their best foot forward, but about the ecosystem of nonprofits in Silicon Valley more broadly. So zooming out, since you fund such a range of them here, what do you think the sector needs to focus on to capture more of the wealth that's generated here?
Yeah, so small but mighty staff. I was actually here when we were a staff of 2, so with about as many grantees. So yeah, I've seen quite a bit. But I think looking at what I have really taken away from the last few years is where we sit in Silicon Valley, the disconnect a little bit between the for-profit side of things and the nonprofit side of things. We are at a place in our region that is so data-driven and looking at impact, and it's so quick, and social change is so painfully slow. But I think there's a way to think about bridging those two, trying to speak the language, coming together with data, knowing where you are, as Irene said, in the context, in the landscape. And so I had a quick conversation yesterday with one of my new staff members about sort of just a social service organization. How does a social service organization that is just dealing with the symptoms, right? And there is a place for that. That is important. We fund Safety Net. How do you report back on what the huge impact is to the community? How do you say that you're changing, if you're trying to feed people who are hungry, how can you say that you're changing the landscape of people and making sure that they don't go hungry? And I think that you don't always have to think about doing everything. You don't have to be an organization that's going to solve hunger by feeding people, but knowing where you are in the landscape, knowing that there are players out in the community working on that problem, talking to each other, thinking about, I'm an organization that has a role to play, and if I'm feeding people, I'm going to do it effectively. I'm going to do it in a sustainable manner. I'm going to get to where the people are that is hungry, and knowing yourself, knowing your organization, knowing how you're doing that, having a case that you're doing that in a really effective way while you're being mindful of the landscape and the players who are in the space that are trying to cure the problems as well. So looking at data, looking at your context, looking at the role that you play in the larger picture, reaching out, networking, and being mindful of that, I think is really important. Oftentimes, and I know, like I said, I was a staff of 2, and I ran a small business, so I've been in that painful seat of having too much to do with too few bodies and too little resources. But I think it is important to prioritize the time so that you're also working on the things that, and I've been tasked, my CEO is always telling me, make sure you're working on the things that are important and not just urgent, because there's always a fire to put out. And getting out knowing that the context is certainly important if it's not immediately urgent.
So a very powerful question that I've seen venture capitalists ask of the organizations they're funding, as well as venture philanthropists who take that same mindset. And it's something that we started asking at the Hewlett Foundation, the program officers there. And it ties into what you just said, Mara, and also is an outcome of going through the process of designing a theory of change, going through a strategic planning process. It's what are you saying no to? Specifically, what have you stopped doing? And so that's a question we used to ask board members and executive directors. Okay, there are lots of opportunities, but what have you said no to this year, and what are you saying no to specifically next year? And going through that process, that is so hard because there's all programming feels great. It's there for a reason, but all program that is not weighted equally against your mission. So having those hard conversations and having that answer in your pocket, what am I saying no to, so that I have strategic focus to help me say yes to a few core things that matter most. That I think will one, be a very powerful message for funders, particularly in this valley, excuse me, but also will be an end result. If you've gone through the building block process here with the theory of change, that's an output of doing that hard thinking. Any final comments? Are there one or two things that you want this group to make sure that they remember when they leave here? Lance.
Just one thing. We didn't name it explicitly, but I think that's where Mara kind of was going with this, and that is whether you're a morning person or an evening person, identify like your one most productive hour a day, and just never schedule anything. That's your reflection, because if you don't reflect, you can't improve. So that's like the single most important thing I can tell you.
I'm going to start that tomorrow. Great. Well, we're just about out of time. On behalf of everyone here, thank you, Irene, Mara, Lance, for sharing your perspectives, your wisdom with the whole group. And just a reminder, funders succeed when their grantees succeed. That's how it works. I'm just so glad that you're all here asking these great questions. Thank you all, each and every one of you, for the important work that we know that you do every day to make Silicon Valley a better place. It's really heroic. We're very aware of that, and we really appreciate that.